Have you ever gotten a bit, shall we say, bent out of shape by something you've read about politics on social media? That is something that happens maybe to a lot of us lately. And today we're going to be talking about how mindfulness can help impact that. My name is Ted Meissner. Welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. And if you do get something out of today's podcast and interview, please do like and subscribe. Thanks so much. Our guest today is Hadley Rahrig. Hadley, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your show.
And I'm so very excited about this because there's so much wonderful work going on at the Center for Healthy Minds. And gosh, let's start by just asking you to say a little bit about yourself, where it is you do the work you do, and what is the work you do.
Absolutely. So I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow conducting research in psychology and neuroscience of emotion and emotion regulation. And I do that work at University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Center for Healthy Minds.
Excellent. So, this paper, there is a lot in there. And for those who are listening or watching this episode on several different platforms, just know that I will be linking to the paper and it is full access. And I really encourage you to read it because there are so many wonderful layers to it. But Adley, I'm wondering if you might just share for a bit what was being investigated in this study and why is that important?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, where should I start? There was a lot going on in this paper. So I mean, the first thing to think about is, it's a paper about the emotion regulation of emotions in political contexts. And this was really born out of the time that I came of age in research, which was around the 2016 election, when we were really seeing this stark polarization between Democratic and Republican leaning peoples in our country. It's something that, we're still experiencing as much as like our political landscape is always growing and changing quite rapidly. Um, but it's something that was very much on my mind and heart when I began grad school, is really considering means to counter polarization, or at least support people in being more thoughtful and, I guess, uh, sources of agents in terms of their political thought and activity. So the research that I conducted was an examination of different emotion regulation interventions. So one was a mindfulness-based intervention, and one was an intervention that primarily used cognitive reappraisal as a form of emotion regulation. The other sort of interesting part of this is it was a neuroscience study. And that's because the neuroscience methodologies I thought could really lend to the the mind framing and perceptual processes that take place when we are absorbing this political information through popular media. And so I was able to use functional near infrared spectroscopy to record brain activity while our participants viewed these short polarizing news clips that could evoke those really strong politically salient emotions. And boy, did they. Participants really did not like these clips. They were very triggered. So, this was like an effective experimental protocol, which we were pleased about. Um, and so, yeah, there was a lot of really interesting findings there to unpack.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see the results and that there are neurologically distinct things that are happening in
Yeah.
each of these, and that
Mhm.
emotions, and this is one of the wonderful points made in the paper, is that emotional responses are contingent on context, that it's not
Mhm.
always just this individual response. There is also a social aspect to that cultural workplace, whatever it happens to be. So I'm wondering if you might just unpack some of of the results, noting that, yep, you had people all the way at the the highest levels of emotional reactivity, and hope was also there, which I found interesting. So
Mhm.
unpack some of the results for us. What was interesting to you about this?
Yeah, gosh, there was a lot that I found interesting. One of the results we weren't expecting was uh, the effects of the mindfulness training relative to the cognitive reappraisal training. So we asked people to rate their discrete emotions, anger, disgust, sadness, fear, joy, um, during real time when they were viewing the videos. And we found actually that although across the board, all participants rated emotions quite high, that, there's a group of participants that had these extreme responses. So like on a scale of like 0 to 100, some participants really were rating things like 90 and above in terms of anger and disgust in particular. And we found that if you had completed the mindfulness training, which is ostensibly intended to regulate those strong emotions that arise when you were triggered by these things, the mindfulness condition actually made it more likely that you would be an extreme responder. So you would respond with extreme levels of disgust and anger. So that was something that was really interesting that we didn't expect. The other thing that was quite interesting was, we did ask people to rate their joy. And if you were assigned to the mindfulness training group, you also responded with higher levels of joy compared to our cognitive reappraisal group. And we don't really know what to make of this. I can speculate, but I do think there's possibly a kernel of hope there in terms of those ratings. And our neural responses diverged between the groups. And those were quite fascinating as well. So with the neuroimaging protocol that we used, I used a neural synchrony approach. And this is really designed to capture this shared emotional responding. It's designed to capture this social context that you mentioned. So it's examining really how similar participants are thinking and perceiving these stimuli are to one another. And it's tapping into that political identity that drives those shared emotional responses. And we found that the two groups were different in terms of neural synchrony in a way that maybe suggested that mindfulness participants, even though they were responding with these extreme emotions, they maybe were responding a little bit more idiosyncratically. So there was less of this shared grouped-based perceptual response to the political videos.
Yeah, and this is interesting in so many different ways. Part of it being the one of the things I noticed is the short-term mindfulness training. So what we're saying here is that the mindfulness intervention was not the heavyweight kind of MBCT, MBSR kind of
Yes.
program where you actually have months to do regular practice.
Mhm.
That with shorter term interventions, and as we see in programs, there's often a bit of an increase as your capacity to notice what's here
Right.
showing up, and that may, again, conjecture, part of the reason why, I'm really noticing the anger, the disgust, the whatever it happens to be, and might not have gotten to the point where I've developed this capacity of emotion regulation. And it's not so
Mhm.
much calling the shots. And in particular, I think part of what you're seeing, wondering about the that idiosyncratic thing, that it's not, I'm going along with what the the mob is thinking. I
Mhm.
have my own responses to this, and there is that unique kind of experience. I'm wondering if you might say just a little bit more about that too, because I think that's one of the more interesting things about it is maybe not as subjective to mob mentality, mob responses, but more the honoring of one's own. this is how I am feeling in this particular moment.
Right, right. And, I'm hoping people are able to draw upon their personal experiences and their personal relationships, which, by all metrics are less stereotyped, are less scary. Um, and, that might be a source of sort of this individualized response that we are seeing. I think something that's important to mention here, when we're talking about these extreme levels of emotion that are arising after short-term training is, I think I don't want to place a value judgment on those emotions. We could see it being the case that anger and disgust are unwanted or unproductive. And in that respect, maybe over time with greater training, people would see a drop off in those levels of emotion, as they are able to sort of navigate their own personal experiences in ways that make their emotion responding a little bit less stereotyped and automatic. Um, but, I'm agnostic about the value. It could be actually a very good thing that they're responding with higher levels of anger and disgust, because people have many different reasons for their political affiliations and their political opinions. And it might be the case, actually, that people are becoming more civically engaged. And that might be a better alternative than a lot of the burnout that I think is commonplace today.
Yeah, and this is such a wonderful point that you're making, Hadley, about this is not judging having an emotional response as a bad thing or a good thing. It
Mhm.
is simply information about how we are encountering the conditions in the moment, our
Mhm.
environment, what is here, and that's helping us to decide, okay, so what do we do about this? And this is part of social mindfulness is an awareness of, and you brought up burnout too. It's the same thing here. Why many burnout programs fail
Mhm.
is that they're really just ways to separate, ignore, suppress emotion or the other
Totally.
difficult outcomes with burnout, which is not just one thing. And instead, it's information. If you're burning out, that's not wrong. That is a response to conditions so that you can make a choice about how to work with those conditions,
Right.
not just numb yourself to what's going on.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
same is so with the political sphere as well. So I want to ask just for you, Hadley, you've mentioned some of the results coming from this. And again, full access on the paper. I do encourage people to read it because it is beautifully put together. You mentioned some of the results of that, some of the unforeseen findings that have come up with that. I'm also wondering for you, what were some of the things that for you were just most fascinating about doing this research, let alone the results themselves?
Sure. I really enjoyed every aspect of the research. It took so long beginning with writing the grant, acquiring funding. Um, Starting the research which was initially conducted in uh, March of 2020 was our start date. And obviously that sort of got postponed and we had to change the protocol to meet the demands of COVID. Um, and, it took us so long to analyze the data and write it up. And I think most people, by the time they're completing their dissertation, are quite sick of it. And I just never was. Like, um, I just really loved it. And I really loved the neural synchrony approach. I really liked being able to show participants videos in real time as opposed to showing participants these static images, which are classically used in social neuroscience experiments. I didn't want to just show people an image of whatever president was in the current administration and measure their brain activation. I wanted to see what are the patterns of real-time neural responses. And I wanted to find a creative way that we could actually, see what emotions are embedded in that, what perceptions of reality are embedded in that. I really enjoyed debriefing participants too, to begin to understand why they had the emotion reactions that they did and how they felt that the interventions were supporting them or not supporting them in terms of navigating those emotions. And I really think I most enjoyed the questions it raised for me and where I would go in the future. And, the biggest thing I learned was we are not stereotypes. We really aren't, regardless of what political party that you belong to, everyone has their own motivations for their political affiliations. It's not like it's portrayed in social media or media more broadly. And it motivated me really to look at specific populations and their motivations and emotions around politics. I just felt like the participant pool I had was, we intentionally were trying to be as diverse as we could, even though it was restricted to people who voted democratically. And the diversity in so many respects was a strength of the study. And at the same time, I realized how much of a weakness it was, because I really couldn't make these claims about why people had the emotion reactions that they did, because people had emotion reactions for so many different reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are always so many factors to try to take into account as best you can with limited funding, because it's
Yeah.
expensive to do brain scans and all the rest of it. And I'm seeing so many research papers coming out now that are based on things that were occurring during COVID. And it is not yesterday's news. This is very relevant, particularly this paper, about what we're seeing not just in the US politically, but overall in the world. So thank you so much for doing this terrific work, and eager to hear more about what you have coming up in future research. And just wondering if you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with the viewers or listeners before we let you get on with the rest of your day.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Any parting thoughts? Sure. Yeah, I think I would love to see more research that looks at mindfulness in these political situations and how it can lend to civic activism or not lend to it, And so I'm really eager to speak to those who are interested in examining similar subjects. I think it's really important right now, and I think it's often quite scary and intimidating to do that kind of research. But I think I love examining mindfulness in social contexts. I think it's really fascinating, and it's important to remember that we live in a historic context when we're thinking about emotions. There's no ahistoric emotion or a social emotion. We are embodied in a time and place in our society. And so it's really important when we do mindfulness work to think about that time and place.
Yeah, and that is a big shift that's been occurring in the field of mindfulness, is increasing awareness that it's not in a vacuum, it's not in isolation. We're in a time, we're in a place, we're in conditions, and that all has an influence, which this paper does a really nice job of sharing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, our guest today, Hadley Rahrig. Thank you so much for being here. And again, for people who are watching, we'll have links where links are found. Hadley, thanks again for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. It was great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us and for learning a little bit more about how our emotions are impacted by social media, particularly in a politically charged environment, and how mindfulness helps with that. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. We'll see you soon on Mindfulness Voyage.